Hey, it's Mike here, and today the battle for the 2020 dietary guidelines here in the US. Recently, the USDA, who forms the guidelines, had a bit of an open session to receive comments by certain members of the public with very different opinions. Each commenter got 3 minutes to try and influence the USDA's guideline board, and it was over 4 hours long, and generally, well, it could be pretty boring.
Not only is drinking water strongly encouraged, but health experts widely recognize water as a preferred source of hydration.
There were still some spicier moments and some sort of feuding / micro dramas because there was a variety of people there, not just industry. There was definitely quite a bit of industry there, but there was also your low carbers as well as a bunch of plant-based / vegan advocates. And really the topics that dominated were carbs. Are carbs bad? Are they good? Along with a lot of discussion about diabetes. And then we also had a lot of anti-dairy sentiment, probably not just from vegans alone. So after grinding through 4 hours of material, I'm excited to get to the interesting stuff. So let's just do this. Let's take a look. Right off the bat, I was very taken off guard, surprised at how many people were going whole foods or plant-based, blah-de-blah.
I want a whole food plant-based diet. So I asked the committee to get rid of the recommendation for a protein and rather focus on whole foods.
Too much animal food, too much dairy, too much processed food.
An Esselstyn-style oil-free vegan diet.
These latter diets, vegetarian, vegan, and whole food plant-based dietary patterns,
a variety of plant foods can supply all essential amino acids.
You know, they hit on the plant-based sentiment over and over again, often back to back. And then the second most prevalent one was the low-carb sentiment. But I got curious, what was the breakdown of, plant promoters versus low-carb people? And ignoring the industries, like even the plant-based industry was there.
I'm here today representing the Plant-Based Foods Association. Decades of research have shown that shifting to a plant-based diet provides an array of health benefits in chronic disease prevention and promotes healthy growth at all life stages.
We are looking at, nearly 20 people who are not part of industry promoting plant-based diets, and then maybe, 9 or so promoting the low carb. So there was definitely more plant-based than low carb representation. I don't know how people get into this, but the numbers are at least worth mentioning. And a lot of those plant-based people were doctors or just highly educated people. I mean, this dude.
I majored in biology at Yale and was a medical student and radiology resident at Tufts. I am board certified in diagnostic imaging as well as in vascular and interventional radiology, a high-tech field utilizing image-guided procedures such as angioplasty and stent placement.
By contrast, the most disrespectful person was this low-carb woman.
If laughter was the best medicine, then the nutritional guidelines are best practice because they're a joke. A joke that's fallen flat.
Wait, I thought vegans were the militant, angry, pushy ones. Actually, all the vegans in this whole session were extremely well-tempered and well-behaved and polite. And Pam Popper, one of those plant-based people, had a lot of good points to say and actually responded directly to this woman.
People advocating high-fat diets, and I personally take offense to anybody who would come up here and say that the dietary guidelines are a joke. That's my opinion. And we've worked with about 100,000 people who have contacted us because they want to regain or maintain their health. Second graders with type 2 diabetes, high school kids with rheumatoid arthritis. And of course, the population's getting fatter and sicker. We put these people on a low-fat, high-fiber, plant-based diet, and they get better. In fact, they get better so quickly that they have to be medically monitored because the drops in blood pressure and glucose levels mean that medications have to be reduced and sometimes withdrawn within a few days.
And we'll get to more of her good points in a little bit, but in a follow-up, she mentioned that woman actually sort of stormed out of the hall and just left a kind of bad taste in everybody's mouth. And there were some other heavy hitters there. Dr. Greger was there, and he just pinpointed, focused right on the processed meat issue and did a really good job.
Bacon, ham, hot dogs, lunch meat, sausage, right? These are known human carcinogens. The official 2018 IARC report couldn't have been clearer. Quote, consumption of processed meat causes cancer of the colorectal. Quote, that's our second leading cancer killer of men and women combined. We know these foods cause cancer. I mean, we try not to smoke around our kids. Why would we send them to school with a bologna sandwich? That's not hyperbole. According to the Surgeon General, living with a smoker increases risk of lung cancer 15%. So the cancer risk of secondhand smoke is comparable to the 16 or 18% increased risk of colorectal cancer, eating the equivalent of a single sausage link a day.
It was basically a 3-minute nutrition facts video. The audience seemed really engaged with it. And I will say I'll leave the timestamps for that below, and a bunch of different timestamps from people on both sides of the aisle, at least the ones that I wrote down. And I felt like clapping for what a woman named Amy Hamlin, who works to get plant-based foods in schools, she works with New York City schools, had to say about processed meats.
And children are more susceptible to carcinogens than adults. We ask the committee to discourage the consumption of processed meats and plainly state that they cause cancer.
Yes, please plainly state that these processed meats cause cancer and get a carcinogen out of the school lunch supply, please. And I want to mention an interesting point about these newer guidelines, and that's that for the first time, they're going to make specific recommendations for pregnant people and children up to 24 months of age. And that brought a very important point from an unexpected source, actually the grain industry on low-carb diets. Here it is.
We believe it is premature to recommend low-carbohydrate dietary patterns to the U.S. population. Research data for low-carb diets is inconsistent for both diabetes and weight loss or maintenance outcomes. Furthermore, based on a recent study, there is potential for increased risk of neural tube defects in infants born to women who consume a low-carbohydrate diet.
Yep, this is true. She was probably referring to this 2018 paper that found a 30% increase in neural tube defects, such as not being born with a brain, in women who ate low-carb diets. So of course, when you're going on a low-carb diet and you're afraid of all carbs, including those whole grains and legumes, which are great sources of folate, of course your folate levels are going to go down, and that could cause risks of neural tube defects. And that's right in line with a pretty recent Swiss vegan study showing that they had about 4 times lower folic acid deficiency rates than people that ate meat. Folic acid deficiency is of course caused by not getting enough folate in your diet. That's why women end up taking folic acid supplements when they're pregnant. They actually adjusted for folic acid supplements in that study, and the reason that the grain industry is pushing it is because grains are a good source of folate. Legumes are also a great source of folate. And this is all very important because we're talking about what to recommend for pregnant women. And so a folic acid deficient diet that all these low carb people are pushing is it's pretty sketchy. And throughout all of the low carb testimony, I did not see anyone make a strong case for why young children should be eating this diet. All right, moving on to something positive. There were some pretty amazing success stories here. There's one by a retired police officer that I think was honestly amazing.
I'm a retired member of the New York City Police Department. 3 years ago, I woke up and I could not see the alarm clock. I found out later that I was blind in one eye and I was going to lose my sight in others. The diagnosis was type 2 diabetes. I had what was considered to be permanent nerve damage in my hands and feet, and I was told I was going to lose some limbs. After 3 weeks of going on a whole food plant-based diet, my eyesight returned. 3 months after, my A1C went from a 17 to a 5.7. The nerve damage in my hands and feet went away. No medicine, no insulin, only food.
Yes, I cheered up on that one, and you should too. But that was probably caused by diabetic retinopathy, a clogging of the fine blood vessels within your eye. And as we know, a whole food vegan diet can open up your arteries, open up those vessels. And I would have liked to see the vegan plant-based camp push even harder into the studies on reversing diseases especially. But this guy backed up some of the diabetes benefits with studies here.
Numerous large cohort studies, Nurses' Health Study, Health Professional Study, etc., EPIC cohorts, Adventist Health Study 1 and 2, they consistently find that a plant-strong diet is associated with reduced incidence and prevalence of type 2 diabetes. In addition, numerous randomized trials demonstrate plant-strong whole food diets are effective in treating type 2 diabetes and other chronic conditions.
There were also some people that shared some amazing success stories of, people they knew or their patients, like this one.
Our 15-day outpatient Jumpstart program teaches our patients to eat an Esselstyn-style oil-free vegan diet without calorie counting or portion control. It has been given 10 times to 250 patients in the Rochester, New York area. For patients whose total cholesterol was over 200, there was an average drop of 50 points by day 15, with one patient dropping her total cholesterol from 299 to 149, a drop of 150 points in just 2 weeks.
At age 50, I was 340 pounds on 15 different medications, including 200 units of insulin a day for type 2 diabetes. I found a doctor, and she sat down with me, and she said, you need a little bit of exercise, and I'm also going to prescribe a whole food plant-based diet. On this new diet, I lost 150 pounds in 10 months. I feel like I've experienced a miracle or emerged from the matrix. What has happened to me? And she said, you're starting to feel normal. Apparently, I'd never felt normal before.
There were also some success stories on the low-carb diet side, mainly focusing on weight loss and diabetes. But they didn't necessarily have the long-term results or the epidemiological support. I mean, here's one, for example.
I'm a type 2 diabetic. I'm obese. I picked up Jason Fung's book, The Obesity Code. And after that, I started a protocol of a ketogenic diet and intermittent fasting, and my A1C went down to 7.8. 6 months later, it was 5.7.
And another plant-based advocate recalls his experience with the Atkins diet. Not so nice.
I'd cycled on and off Atkins for about 20 years. I was always able to lose a little bit of weight, but then I would put it back on, and I never knew why. And when I failed on each of these diets, I would feel shame.
And I think the plant people did a good job at highlighting why these, low-carb benefits don't necessarily equate to good long-term health or full system health. Here's Pam Popper again.
If you take a look at high-fat diets, low-carb diets, the measurements short-term show that the benefits are there. People lose weight and their numbers come down. But if the only thing we're going to do is consider short-term benefits, there are a lot of things that cause people to lose weight and have good biomarkers. One's cocaine addiction. I've never had a fat cocaine addict in my office, and I've never had one with high cholesterol or high fasting glucose levels. Now, I'm being facetious, of course, but the point is if the only thing that counts is short-term, a lot of things are short-term good, bad, and the long term, because it takes a long time for cancer to develop.
The carb conversation continues, and Dr. Garth Davis was there, and he sort of summed up the carb fear amazingly.
They're petrified of a banana. You could hold up a bank with a piece of bread. People are so scared of carbs. I wrote a book saying we should be eating protein first and we should be on ketosis diets. But you know what happens to these ketosis patients? They end up eventually on my operating room table when they failed this diet over and over again.
And it's worth mentioning who is probably the most highly educated low-carb advocate. She was a doctor and a scientist, yet she believed that 1/3 of all of the U.S. is required to go on a low-carb diet to fight their insulinemia or high insulin levels, which are primarily caused by insulin sensitivity.
I'm a nutritional medicine physician at Pounds Transformation in West Hartford, Connecticut. I have my training in internal medicine, primary care, a bachelor's in biochemistry, and a master's in human nutrition. But I am here today to bring to your attention a substantial class of Americans that are not currently being evaluated. These are Americans with hyperinsulinemia. These Americans require a low carbohydrate dietary pattern. And with numbers like 100 million, I'm not too sure giving a blanket statement about how much starch and sugar we should all be consuming is a great idea.
And it's just completely ridiculous to say that people require a low-carb diet when you're looking at vegans who eat way more carbs and have such better insulin sensitivity that they have 78% lower total risk of diabetes from the Adventist studies. And Garth Davis also touched briefly on how these insulin issues can be caused by animal fat building up in the body, and so removing carbs is just a band-aid.
People say insulin resistance and acting as if carbs cause insulin resistance. That is not true. Animal protein and animal fat causing intramyocellular fat, causing ceramide toxicity, causes insulin resistance.
So the low-carb woman had an impressive level of education, but not a very impressive level of claims. So let's move on to probably the most important point here. Dr. Milton Mills made it, among others, that whole carbs are different from refined carbs. Duh.
People trash carbs left, right, and center here and never mention glycemic index. Whole food carbs that have their fiber are excellent. The ones that have their fiber removed, those are the problems. It's not carbs, it's the processed carbs.
And this nutritionist and professor went a step further and actually urged them to make this distinction a part of the guidelines.
The 2020 guidelines should make a clear distinction between whole foods that contain healthy carbohydrates, fruits, vegetables, beans or pulses, and whole grains, and those that contain highly processed carbohydrates, the added sugars, white flours, and foods made from them.
And here's a great piece of logic by a nurse who is representing other nurses on the topic of whole carbs.
We know that type 2 diabetes is not a result of eating too many apples or sweet potatoes or even whole wheat bread. But I have patients who have been led to believe that all carbs are bad and that somehow a greasy burger without a bun will save them.
And at a few points, people mentioned higher carb-consuming civilizations, the Okinawans and their sweet potatoes and so forth. But of course, the low-carbers just want to outright deny this. They want to ignore it. back to that one woman.
And it doesn't matter if it comes from whole grain or cane sugar or 100% fruit juice. A carb is a carb is a carb. If you have pre-diabetes or diabetes, you are essentially carbohydrate intolerant. Please reduce the recommended carbohydrate intake by half to reflect the current health status of our nation.
Not only was this woman a little out of line, she was straight up out of touch with reality. Not all carbs are the same. This is verifiably incorrect. We look at whole grains, they reduce risk of mortality among other diseases, and that's the tip of the iceberg, but I'll move on. Another familiar face on the other side of the aisle was Nina Teicholz. I have an old school video about her. She comes up every once in a while. She's a low-carb proponent and author who, wanted to push that her organization was not funded by industry, therefore she wasn't biased, was the implication.
My name is Nina Teicholz. I'm a science journalist and author of the book, The Big Fat Surprise. The failures of science and policymaking that I discovered through that investigation compelled me to create the Nutrition Coalition, a nonprofit group dedicated to the public interest. It receives no industry support.
The reality is, though, the better she makes low-carb look, the more books she sells, so that's, just worth mentioning.
The dietary guidelines issued by USDA and HHS are not based on the most rigorous evidence, since this evidence has, since the launch of the guidelines, been ignored and or excluded. Ignoring scientific evidence is not okay.
The other guidelines ignored new data, maybe like this new dairy industry-funded study showing that saturated fat isn't that bad after all. But you will always ignore this massive meta-analysis of 395 clinically controlled trials showing that the higher the saturated fat intake, the higher the cholesterol levels, and higher LDL or bad cholesterol equals atherosclerosis. It's a causal relationship. She then spends the second half of her time criticizing their whole process.
That the process established in the guidelines was not using the best practices for conducting systematic reviews and, quote, lacked scientific rigor, unquote. The guidelines currently are not on track to repeat the same mistakes of the past.
I do agree that being more scientifically rigorous would be better, but if they were more scientifically rigorous, they would not end up choosing her diet. And one piece of science, this meta-analysis, that I was sad to see that nobody mentioned, showed that people who ate low-carb diets have a 30% increased risk of all-cause mortality. Small detail. She was then followed by low-carber Darren Schmidt, who, just to sum it up, had the angle of saying, let's not worry about the foods at all, let's just have a low-carb diet in there so all of the industries can be satisfied.
So I've been teaching low carb to my patients since 1998 and ketosis in the last 4 years. And I said, fit your macros into these guidelines. So you can be plant-based, you can be meat-based, whatever. And then when you do that, you're not liable to upsetting special interests.
I give them credit for appealing to the actual state of mind, the mindset of the USDA when making these decisions with all the pressure from industry. But again, that just completely ignores the benefits of whole carbs and is ridiculous in many ways. So let's move on. All right, let's touch on the whole dairy topic because it really, to me, seemed to be the dairy industry versus the world. There was a massive trend of ragging on dairy, and here are some of the instances of that.
As a silver medal winning Olympian, I am deeply concerned about the USDA's profit-driven recommendation that Americans consume dairy foods.
We are the only species that continues to consume dairy after the age of weaning, and the dairy that we consume is that of another mammal, which makes zero sense. It's sort of gross if you think about it.
Dairy products are the #1 source of saturated fats in the American diet, and scientific evidence has clearly tied dairy consumption to heart disease and high cholesterol. Research has closely linked dairy to female reproductive diseases, acne, ear infections, asthma, and allergies. Dairy, whether it's derived from industrial agriculture or grass-fed cows, contains high levels of estrogen, pus, feces, and other contaminants.
For the USDA to continue to put its stamp of approval on a product that is unnecessary and unhealthy and rooted in a highly oppressive system is unconscionable.
And a lot of people emphasize lactose intolerance, especially among minority groups.
80 to 100% of Asian Americans, African Americans, Native Americans, and Latino Americans are affected by lactose intolerance.
65% of the global population is lactose intolerant, according to the National Institute of Health.
People of color have high rates of lactose intolerance. Humans simply have no need for milk past the age of weaning, much less milk from another species, for our guidelines to be encouraging consumption by people whose normal biology does not tolerate it is frankly a form of racial bias.
And they go on to say that the dietary guidelines for Americans should clearly indicate that dairy products are optional.
And Milton Mills came at them hard with why the, let's say, racial distribution of the panel might lead to such conclusions as to support dairy.
I actually came here this morning to call out the racism that is inherent in the U.S. Dietary Guidelines, but then as I got a look at this committee, I suddenly understood why it's such an intractable problem. This committee bears no relationship to the general makeup of the American populace. Now, that is not a attack on any of you as individuals.
Milton finished with this amazing statement.
We have no more reason to suck on the teats of a cow than we have to suck on the breasts of a postpartum weasel.
Accurate, Milton. Accurate. The dairy industry, of course, advocated for only having real cow lactations on the docket.
I'm the manager of regulatory affairs at the National Milk Producers Federation. I'd like to emphasize the need to maintain dairy's current position as a distinct food group, as well as the recommendation that consumers ages 9 and older receive 3 servings of dairy a day. The committee should continue to only include real dairy products in the dairy category.
Other industries that were present included the egg and meat industries, such as beef, who seemed to get together and try and nail home points on choline, which we'll talk about more in a second. Here they are.
For the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, a contractor to the beef checkoff, during pregnancy and the early years of life, beef delivers the necessary protein, zinc, choline, B vitamins, and iron.
And of course, to ignore the ludicrous levels of cholesterol in eggs, you gotta focus on something else. Here's the egg industry.
Most Americans are well below the adequate intake recommendation for choline, with only about 8% of adults and 8.5% of pregnant women meeting the AI.
And then we have a woman who presents herself as, a bit of a neutral choline researcher that just happens to be there.
Good morning. My name is Marie Cadell, and I'm a choline researcher in the Division of Nutritional Sciences at Cornell University. The best dietary sources of choline are animal source foods like eggs and meat. However, consumers are often advised to limit these foods in their diet.
The most impressive point about her that she was able to be the head author of a study that was not just supported by the egg industry, but also the beef industry.
Eggs and meat.
In the industry, we call that a double egg burger. She presents choline as this thing that everybody is deficient in, especially if they don't eat animal products.
With public health calls to shift eating patterns away from animal-based foods, a potential unintended consequence is a further lowering of choline intake.
And choline needs a whole video. The egg industry is majorly trying to influence doctors, nutritionists, etc. But it's funny how she only mentioned animal sources. She didn't mention how, for example, from the USDA, soybeans have more choline than beef, quinoa has comparable choline to meats like pig muscle, or how soy flour and wheat germ are both, roughly comparable to eggs. So you can get choline from plants, and you can actually make it yourself to a reasonable amount, which is why it wasn't really considered essential until a few organizations said it was essential somewhat recently. Both the researcher and the egg industry both pushed the association between low choline levels and neural tube defects.
Higher maternal choline intakes are also associated with a reduced risk of having a baby with a neural tube defect.
But this newer study, for example, found no significant difference in pregnancy choline levels between healthy and neural tube defect pregnancies. It could just be a marker for lower nutrition in standard American diets, for example, not necessarily causal. They then hired Dolly Parton to sing about choline for 3 minutes.
Choline, 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 choline.
And it's also worth mentioning, as you might know from my recent TMAO video, that choline is processed into TMAO in the guts of people that, eat a reasonable amount through animal protein. It doesn't happen in people who eat plant-based diets. And TMAO fuels heart disease. Other wings of the government, like the NIH, have recognized this. And I have another important point about a particular claim that the egg guy made.
Eggs are also a bioavailable source of the carotenoids lutein and zeaxanthin. In infants, the observation that lutein is preferentially taken up by the developing brain suggests a role in neural development.
Well, the level of these two carotenoids is so low that it's actually illegal for them to advertise, as Gregor highlighted in this video. 1 spoonful of spinach has as much as 9 eggs, and in order to get your, 10,000 units of this stuff that would be good for preventing eye damage, you'd have to eat several dozen eggs. So the animal product industries have some pretty empty claims, but the question is, will the USDA think that they are empty, or will they want to fill their pockets? There are so many other highlights. I just want to include a few. We have this woman from the True Health Initiative.
We do not have a protein deficiency problem in the United States.
We have a vegetable deficiency problem. We have a fiber and vitamin deficiency problem. And we have a food system sustainability deficiency problem.
We also have vegan advocate Sean Hennessy hitting it with the athlete point.
Plant-powered diets rich in fiber are becoming very popular, including for athletes performing at the highest levels, such as tennis star Serena Williams and Olympic weightlifter Kendrick Ferris.
And finally, there was a lady from the potato industry who, don't get me wrong, had some good points, but I thought it was funny how it's like she was personally wronged about the attacks on potatoes.
Here today on behalf of the National Potato Council. Although potatoes are a vegetable, they've been historically stigmatized in past editions of the dietary guidelines.
Now, there were a ton of great points by people on the plant-based side that I just don't have time to include here, but in terms of the low-carb battle, it's very clear that low-carb diets have risks. They have that increased risk of mortality, as that Grain woman mentioned, the increased risk of neural tube birth defects in women on low-carb diets. We also have the questionable weight regain and long-term health effects. By contrast, plant-based diets really demonstrate in the epidemiology that we have lower risk of these diseases. We have the clinical trials showing the reversal of these diseases, which I would have liked people to put more emphasis on. We also have the normal BMI average, and finally, the ability to reverse diabetes without leveraging your heart arteries when heart disease is our #1 killer. And I really hope that the USDA can take some of these recommendations to heart, removing recommendations for processed meat, adding more recommendations for plant-based alternatives, and going the way of Canada, where they took industry out of the equation and, funnily enough, ended up being very plant-based friendly. And I have the video from the day that those guidelines came out linked below and linked at the end. All right, this video is brought to you by my 1 in 1,000 subscribers that support me on Patreon. So thank you so much. Keep me going. If you want to be generous like them, you can click below at the end, but let me know down below what you thought about all of these comments. I thought it was a very entertaining process. Also, feel free to like, subscribe, share the video, and always remember,
we have no more reason to suck on the teats of a cow than we have to suck on the breast of a postpartum weasel.
I am tired of cutting people open for obesity and rearranging their intestines.
The real drug dealers are not those who are wearing baggy blue jeans on our corners. I've learned they're the pharmaceutical companies that have our parents addicted to drugs. It has never been my DNA. It was my dinner. It was my dinner. It was my dinner.